With this particular presentation was introduce you to sort of the first steps of doing river restoration and use the project that we've been doing with Lusk Tidy Towns, so Colin Rodrigo, his team, that's funded and supported by LAWPRO. So we've been working a lot with Aina Gallagher, who's here in the corner, and also with the support of Fingal County Council and of course with Lusk Tidy Towns as well. So using this project, I want to sort of give you a window into what it's like when we start thinking about doing river restoration. So any river restoration project starts by asking three main questions. Firstly, what kind of condition is my river in? Secondly, why? Are there things that are acting upon or impacting my river for better or worse? If it's for worse, we call those pressures. And the third thing is, what potentially can we do to try and improve river condition, particularly if we think that the river is suffering or maybe not as good in terms of habitat quality as maybe it could be. Those questions were the things that Lusk Tidy Towns are sort of mulling over, just off the basis of their own observations, really, of their local landscape. So anyone who's been around Lusk for a while can see there's been a number of new housing developments that have happened over time, so the landscape's changed a little bit. The Tidy Towns group could see that there, over a period of a couple of years, had been some interventions into one part of the channel in town for flood risk purposes, and they were curious as to implications for the habitats in relation to that practice. And they were also aware that the streams that are running through this catchment, they exit out into Rogerstown Estuary, which is a protected area. It's an SAC. So they were just aware of what's happening in their neck of the woods could be affecting something downstream, and they just got a bit curious about that. So they brought us on board and they asked two sort of specific questions. That was our mandate. And the first one was to characterise the baseline ecological and hydromorphological condition of two streams in the area. So hope you can see on the map all right, but we're sort of somewhere about here, I think, in Lusk. Maybe I've got the map wrong, but this blue one we called the Lusk stream just because it was closer to Lusk. And this red one we called the Rush stream because it was closer to Rush. So these two streams, what's the baseline ecological condition? So ecology is probably a term we're all familiar with, but that's everything that's living, okay, so flora and fauna. And to also think about hydromorphology, and that might be a slightly newer term. It's one that's used primarily in Europe, actually. And what hydromorphology is essentially the form and the function of the river. So how does it move flow and sediment through the system? How does it organise that sediment within the river cross-section to create habitats for our ecology? So the ecology is about what's alive, what should be here, maybe what shouldn't be here, and the hydromorphology is about the processes that support those species. So let's have a look at both of those things and see what kind of conditions we've got in these streams. And then the second part was to identify potential measures to improve those conditions. So firstly, how can we improve habitat quality? And then secondly, how can we improve the actual function of the watercourse? So that was our remit. In terms of the methods, we went out and we did, I think we went out about 7 different times between April and June doing surveys. So we walked everywhere that we could get access to, and we'll talk about land access towards the end of this talk, from the top of the catchment all the way to the bottom along these streams. So my colleague Will, who unfortunately isn't here today, but he did the ecology survey, and he did what's called a riparian ecology survey. So he looks in the in-stream environment, but he also looks in what's called the riparian zone. You might be familiar with that term. The riparian zone is the transition between our purely aquatic in-stream environment and our purely terrestrial environment out of the floodplain. So the riparian zone is really sort of the banks, the top of the river bank, and a bit of the ways out away from the top of the channel. So it's a really important ecological zone, and it's really important for river function as well. So what Will did was, as we were walking along, he was looking at vegetation in the stream, in the riparian zone, at ground level, shrubs, trees. He was looking at diversity, he's looking at species continuity. He also looked at all sorts of critters, which was quite interesting for me because I don't have any background in ecology. So he was picking up bits of rock from the river and looking at the critters that were attached to the bottom of the sediment. So he's looking at all sorts of bugs. He's looking for bat roosts. He looked at birds, listened to bird song. He looked for any evidence of different mammals. He looked for amphibians, all sorts of different things. And he ended up creating a whole bunch of different habitat maps, so we know what kind of habitats we've got along this river. While he was there, I was doing what was called the hydromorphology survey, and we used a method called the River Hydromorphology Assessment Technique, or RAT, or RHAT. People call it something, everyone calls it something different. I call it RAT just out of ease. What effectively I was doing as I'm walking along the river is I'm looking at its form and I'm looking at how it's moving sediment through. So what kind of condition is the riverbed in? What kind of material have we got on the riverbed? How is it organising that material? What's in our banks? Do we have unimpeded flow all the way along the length of the river, or are there things that are blocking the flow? I'm thinking about what kind of vegetation we've got, how that's interacting with the channel, and I'm looking at how much our river is interacting with our floodplain, potentially or not at all. So it's looking at a whole bunch of different things and ultimately scoring the reach based on that form and function, and then sort of coming up with a classification of bad, poor, moderate, good, or high. So it aligns with the Water Framework Directive. So when Will and I did all our surveys, we then came together and we looked at the river as a whole, and we said, can we break it into segments where there is similar condition and similar processes, so where the function is similar. And that's called reach delineation. So we divided it into these segments where everything was sort of similar. That was really useful for then doing the next step, which was thinking about ways to improve the habitat or the processes, because it meant that we could look at individual segments that all operated the same sort of way and think about these kinds of interventions would be appropriate there. So that's the last step that we did, which is that optioneering or measure identification process. We sort of sat down individually and I thought, okay, if I was going to restore this river from a hydromorphology perspective, what's my long list of things I would possibly do? Will did the same from an ecology perspective, and then we brought the two lists together, and there was quite a lot of crossover, probably unsurprisingly. And we essentially identified for each reach a long list of measures that we thought could potentially, in future conversations, be explored in that area. And so we end up with a bunch of different maps of ideas for Lusk Tidy Towns and other groups to possibly take forward in the future. So I thought I'd give you a bit of a taste of the results because we have finished the study now. Ecology scorecard, not great. Poor to sort of moderate condition, definitely could be improved. So from a vegetation perspective, Will sort of felt that maybe the species diversity could be improved. And in particular, the continuity of our riparian zone. So we would often have maybe a small stretch of riparian vegetation, and then because of development pressures or maybe agricultural practices, we then had a real lack of riparian vegetation, and that's quite problematic from a habitat perspective. We also found one invasive species that hadn't been identified in the area before, which we'll talk to the council about, and we'll probably need to see if we can get on fairly quickly. We also had some subcontractors, because we don't do it ourselves, but it's called electrofishing, and they're a specialist group. They go out to the top of the catchment, the middle of the catchment, the bottom of the catchment, and they put in a very weak electrical pulse into a small section of the channel. Just shocks the fish so they can pick them up and identify them. It's all above board and approved by Inland Fisheries Ireland. You have to be permitted, so don't think we were doing something rogue. And they identified species, and unfortunately the report card was quite poor in terms of fish diversity. We mainly found only what's called three-spined stickleback, and they're just a fish that they're just like cruddy rivers, really. So we didn't find the nice things like salmonids. We didn't find lamprey. We didn't find too many eel down the bottom end where we might have expected them. So the fisheries report card wasn't great, and we think that's largely linked to the lack of habitat, which links in with the riverine process. The good news story, though, was that we did see some evidence of otter, and we did see some evidence of badger, which is really positive, and gives us ideas for maybe where Lusk Tidy Towns and LAWPRO and the council can go next. So that's ecology. In terms of hydromorphology, so I said we did this method and we broke the river into these reaches, and each of these coloured segments is a different reach. This map shows you sort of the scores that they came up with. And the vast majority, the black is where we couldn't get in because of land access issues, but the vast majority of the catchment we can see is coming up red, so bad, or orange, which is poor, okay? I like to present it like this because you get a really quick snapshot overview of what the general sort of condition is. And there are a number of pressures that are acting on our watercourse. Some of them are historical, some of them are modern, that explain that condition. So what I thought I would do is give you a bit of an example of each of the different classifications that we saw out in the field. So textbook example of a river reach that's probably going to score bad from a hydromorphology perspective is one where we maybe have a big weir, or maybe we have a very long culvert, or we have a lot of extensive hard bank protection. The weir in particular is problematic. It backs up the flow, it drops lots of sediment out, it acts as a barrier to the downstream transport of sediment, and that has implications for the downstream development of our habitats. So whenever we see structures like this, it's probably going to come up something like bad. Another example is where we have had extensive channel modification, and that's maybe where it's happened historically as part of an effort to dry land out to make it more productive. It might be a more modern intervention linked to flood risk management. But what we see in the field, on the left-hand image here, it's what we call over deep. Really, really deep compared to its floodplain. It's got absolutely no hope of ever contacting with its floodplain. And the process is quite off. It tends to just keep cutting down, which almost exacerbates the process, and it's not in great nick. It's also really unsafe because the banks are sort of almost vertical and you could really hurt yourself if you fell in. So over deep, and then the one on the right-hand side there, that's an example of a channel that's over wide. So when historically we've gone in and we've maybe modified the channel by dredging or digging it out, for example, we also call it channel cleaning sometimes. What happens is we spread the energy in the flow over a much wider area. And that means the river doesn't have power to move not only its flow, but its sediment through the system and organize it in a way that creates those habitats. So what you end up getting is a riverbed that's just sort of covered in fine muck. It's very problematic in areas where you do have fine sediment pressures, be they from agriculture, be they from urban runoff. So looking at dealing with a channel that's over wide and helping it to narrow is something that we're always going to be trying to do in these sorts of circumstances. So these kinds of rivers that come up bad, we can see the processes are really heavily impacted. It's almost like, to be quite colloquial about it, they've forgotten how to be rivers. So they need to have a bit of an intervention to help them get back on their feet. Here's an example of a poor river reach, just a little snapshot picture. Similar sorts of things. You're going to have the same modification pressures in a lot of the poor reaches, often more over wide as opposed to over deep. But one of the things we start to see in the poor reaches are things like pressures from land use practices. So here you can see that kind of really hummocky ground in front there. That's trampling from cattle. So the cattle have direct access into the river. They're not fenced off at all. So they trample the banks. It adds fine sediment pressure into the stream, which is problematic for our gravel habitats. Fish aren't super happy, bugs aren't super happy, so we've got an issue there. And obviously the banks then become very unstable, and maybe we have you can have excessive erosion rates in those kinds of areas. So we start to see pressures like that. What is more positive though about our poor reaches is that we start to see the slightest hint that the river still remembers how to be a river. So in this particular picture, you can see this kind of dappled flow here and then sort of quite smooth flow behind it. The dappled flow there is where the river has still got enough guts that it can move some of its coarse sediment, so like gravels or cobbles, and accumulate them into a feature. Here we call that a riffle. Okay, and that creates an area of shallow flow. It's often cleaner gravels, which is good for our ecology. It helps to oxygenate the river, so it's the start, it's the hint of a bit of riverine process happening, but its ability to do much more than that is really impacted still by the pressures acting upon it. The fact that maybe it was dredged, it's still disconnected from its floodplain, there's no riparian zone, things like that. It gets better when we start to get to moderate reaches, okay, of which we found 2 in our study area. And the defining feature of the moderate kind of reach is that they have more established riparian vegetation. So we'll have wider riparian zones, mature, established vegetation that as tree branches naturally fall down, okay, maybe in high flows, maybe as the tree naturally, passes away, wood enters the channel, and wood is really critical for supporting the morphological processes, so that river process. What the wood does as it falls in the channel is it helps to create complexity in the flow dynamics around that piece of wood. So if wood has fallen in and we've got flow sort of coming this way, it sort of hits the wood and it can help drop out some of those coarser gravels and kick-start some of those feature formation processes. And that helps ultimately, if I show you a picture here, this is an example of a good reach. You can see here this wood structure, okay, that's fallen in. And you can see all that coarse material, it's sort of yay big, lots of large gravels. It's deposited behind it because the flow direction's into me. But what you can see is a gravel bar there, and a gravel bar here, and a gravel bar here supported by wood. And what we've got is narrowing of the channel, so the river's a bit happier in terms of its geometry, and it's able to create this sinuous kind of pathway. So it starts putting a bit of pressure on the outside bank and maybe undercutting, creating this nice asymmetry across the river cross-section. Pools for the fish to live in, shallower areas for all the bugs and for the fish to be eating things. So that's kind of the importance of the riparian zone and the addition of wood into the channel. Even though we only saw 2 moderate reaches and 1 good reach in the entirety of our study, glass half empty, we'd say, oh, geez, that's not great. Glass half full, well, geez, we know where we can go. I saw enough evidence in the poor reaches that these rivers, particularly the rush stream, it still remembers how to be a river. And if we can take those pressures off and help kickstart some of those processes, she's going to end up like this. So she knows what to do. We've just got to figure out how we can get her to that spot. So these kinds of things are really promising for us because it shows us what direction we can go in. So once we had all that survey information, then we started doing that optioneering process where we're looking at each reach, what could we possibly do here? The first thing that I always think when we're doing optioneering is to address pressures. So if it is over wide, would it be appropriate in this particular landscape context? Okay, so we've got top of catchment, middle catchment, bottom catchment, depends what the land use is, depends what's going on around it. Would it be appropriate here to intervene, maybe add some wood, maybe look at adding some gravel features to try and kickstart that natural narrowing of the channel? Would it be appropriate to try and connect laterally into our floodplain? It's often limited potential, but there are ways that we can do it. In particular, in this particular catchment, are there ways that we can fence stock from the waterways? Can we plant up those riparian zones? Can we widen them? What we did in the report for this project, Will wrote quite an extensive list for if we were in the future to pursue like a planting program for the riparian zone. So he sort of said, look, if you're going to go and do planting, these are the kinds of habitats that we have, but there are some tree species that are underrepresented, and so I would start there, for example. And he did that for the ground flora, for the shrubs, for the trees. And really importantly, he said, okay, but the species list is slightly different if we're at the top of the catchment or we're at the bottom of the catchment, because we're different landscape contexts. So what he's trying to do is give sort of a list that, that Tidy Towns, if there were ever community planning days or those sorts of initiatives, they can go and pursue. So we come up with a list of those kinds of things to address pressures, but we also think, gosh, in an ideal world, what else could we do? So not just pressure mitigation, but more sort of improvement opportunities. For me, that's very much the lateral stuff with connecting to the floodplain. So I'm looking, as I'm walking down the river, I can see where it used to maybe connect out, and I would ask questions, could you do that reconnection? But I'm also thinking practically, because obviously there's land uses that are happening on our floodplains, and there would need to be a lot of conversations, obviously, with landholders about using the floodplain in a different way or using a small part of the floodplain in a different way. So I'm thinking about ways that we could maybe regrade the bank to just create a little bit of connectivity, and I'm mapping up where I think that would be most appropriate to maybe try and have those conversations. One of the things Will also recognised was that we saw otters, okay, or evidence of otters, but we don't think that they are, nesting is the wrong word, but forgive me as I'm not an ecologist, but we don't think that they're rearing their young in the catchment. They're just sort of like moving through maybe for food sources. So one of his ideas is, okay, well, one of the things that we could do is build these artificial holts for them. So it's effectively like an apartment complex really for an otter. And that's the kind of thing that we'd be pointing out to the Tidy Towns group and to LAWPRO that can be done really cheaply, really easily, and just by the community. Whereas other options are more complicated and will obviously need a lot of partnership between maybe different funding partners, definitely with landholders. And the other one that we've just got a picture of down there, that's a nest box for grey wagtails. He could see that there are some in the catchment. He thinks there's a real opportunity to expand their range just by putting things like that super easy on the outside of a bridge. So then there's conversations that maybe we'd have with the council, for example. So we came up with all of those options. We mapped them onto an image of each reach so that Lusk Tidy Towns and LAWPRO and the council have a document, then they can have there's a map image. This is what the baseline condition. There's a map image. These are the things that we think potentially you could have conversations about if you're interested. And behind that, we had sort of a page or 2 pages that explained why we're recommending these sorts of measures in these sorts of areas, and maybe flagging up things to think about or to have conversations about. For example, if there is a conversation about a way that a channel is being managed, if it is being cleaned. Often that's maybe for flood risk reasons, and if we're going to try and do things a little bit differently, we normally will need to do modelling to support that argument, and that will require hydrology data, and if we don't have that data, then that's going to limit that conversation. So what we wanted to do in our report was just give a flavour of some of the things that will be relevant down the line in the river restoration kind of conversation, noting that we won't necessarily be a part of the whole journey, but to give as much information and as many tools as possible for that, those next steps. So last slide here, I just wanted to flag a few things. If any of you are thinking of doing this kind of first step into river restoration type project yourselves, as a consultancy, anyone that you hire to go and do the surveys, if you do have to go external for them, will make assumptions about land access and about it being organised for us, because we're not local to the community. So what we did with Lusk Tidy Towns, and Lusk and Rush Tidy Towns were fabulous in this regard. I would send them images like this, okay? I've just pulled a screenshot off Google Maps, and I've put a little star everywhere where I can see there's maybe a farmhouse or a private property. And I said, I'd love to get in there. I'd like to be able to park my vehicle, and I would love it if they would let me walk the river from their property. And so what Lusk and Rush did was they went and door knocked those people and had a conversation, explained the project, to just sort of see whether or not people would agree to that access. And that meant that they could give me a list of this person lives here and this is their phone number, and they broadly agree, which is great. We had a huge support from the community in this. And that was fab, because it meant that 2 or 3 days before we went out, I just rang and said, are you still okay for us to go on your property? Would you like to be present? would you like to come with us? Some people are very relaxed, some people less so, and they would like to accompany you on their land, which is their right. So just conscious that there is a bit of work to be done between you to try and arrange that land access. The other thing just for you to note is the timing of surveys. From an ecology perspective, the electrofishing that I mentioned, the subcontractor, they can only do that between July and September because that's a permitted activity. The ecology surveys in general, spring, summer, and they're going to want to go probably repeat throughout summer because some of the vegetation is difficult to identify until it gets a bit more grown. And from my perspective in hydromorphology, I don't go out before March and I won't go out after October because the river levels are too high, I can't see anything. So you're really looking at spring, summer timing for surveys like this. And ecology consultants get very, very busy because everyone needs all the surveys done in summer. So what was great with this project was that we were having conversations in winter, so before even Christmas last year, 2024. So we knew it was coming, we could program it in, and it was well organised. So the sooner you can give people that you might be employing the heads up, the better. And the last point I just wanted to make there was about project scope. So we had sort of classic river restoration questions in this project, but your projects might have slightly different questions. You know, oh, we have a sediment issue at a bridge here, or we're concerned about excessive erosion at this particular rate, or we've got a really specific ecology question. Depending on your research question will drive your methods. It's never a one, size fits all for these kinds of projects. Obviously, if you're thinking about doing this kind of thing, you'll be in discussion with LAWPRO, you'll be in discussion with the council. Just to make the point, you are so welcome also to ring consultancies. A big part of what we do is give advice about how to do these projects and the methods that you might want to use, and give you ballpark costs that can help to feed into your grant applications. So I just wanted to make the point that you're very welcome to ring. And on that note, there's my contact details. If you ever want to just pick up the phone and have a chin wag about a project idea you're very welcome to ring. And I can put you onto my ecology colleagues if that's more what you're interested in. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.